What we need to do is change the direction that we're going, which is industrializing food and adding things that we think should be there that makes up for things that now are missing because of breeding programs, which are focused on mainly one thing: high yield. And with wheat, that has been accomplished by making the plants shorter, by making the plants more resistant to disease, more resistant to insects. On the farm level, at the milling level, they want higher yields too. Everybody wants higher yields, right? But that's more money. And the millers have had the plant breeders make the bran harder, so it's easier to flake off. Now you've got bran that can be flaked off very close to the endosperm and make higher percent of white flour. In recent years, as you well know, people have decided that they want to have a little bran in their flour. They've discovered that there's a reason why the pigs were doing so well that were eating the bran, you see. And they thought they wanted to eat at least as good as the pigs. So that's my theory. And so they started asking for whole wheat flour. Well, the millers then would take that bran and they would add a little bit back and they call it whole wheat flour. The big commercial ones at least. But those bran particles now, because they're so hard, they're quite brittle and have very sharp edges when they're broken. And when you eat them, for some people who have sensitivities, they irritate the gut because that bran now is kind of sharp, like little knives, pieces of glass going through you. And it's not really massaging and washing and cleaning your gut the way it was designed to originally. Old heritage wheats and ancient wheats mostly have bran that's much softer. And that's why the texture of whole grain, and unless now that the industry has figured out how to pulverize it so fine that you don't get it. But in the early days when you had whole wheat, you could always taste or feel a scratchiness in the back of your throat. That was from the bran particles. And you didn't get that with modern wheat, or with ancient wheat milled in the same way. So that was some of the things that were going on. The bakers, they didn't want to be left out. They wanted more bread. Well, you can get more bread for less wheat by, guess what, adding more air. So they wanted to add more air to their bread. And the way you can do that is by changing the protein and the starch complexes so that when the gluten develops, it is very much more elastic and can hold a lot more air in those little tiny air cells that you see when you cut open a white loaf of bread, and very easy to see them. The more of those you have, the more loaves of bread you can make out of less wheat. And that was their goal. That's probably one of the biggest things that has changed the wheat and changing the proteins and the gluten in modern wheat to do that. Without really knowing for sure what's going on. But I'm suspecting that that's a big item. Another thing that's going on, and this has nothing to do with the breeding. So they have the breeding problem. Then you also have the cultivation problem, because the cultivation now, in order to produce our national goal of cheap food and plentiful food, is to increase yields. And if you do that by breeding to get a higher yield potential, then you can reach that potential by fertilizing at much higher rates and pouring on the nitrogen. So those plants will grow and grow and grow. And then, of course, you perfect the chemicals to help eliminate weeds and diseases and pests, so that only thing in that field growing is wheat, and it's growing very well. And that's the goal. And that's been accomplished. There's a few other things that are happening that people don't normally talk about. First of all, the contamination of residues that are still on the grain when you eat it. The government says don't worry about that because we've tested all these chemicals one by one. They don't emphasize that part, but that's how they do it. They tested the chemicals one by one, and they've established what they consider the safe level for residues on your food. But what we're eating, actually, are not single chemicals. We're eating a cocktail of chemicals that have been put on that crop. So what they should do in their research is test for a cocktail of those chemicals and see what they do. And when some people have done this, they see a much different result. The synergistic effect of those compounds upon each other is much greater than the sum of the individual ones. And this is what we're eating. And this is why more and more people, I think, are having more and more trouble eating non-organic and also highly residue contaminated foods.